Good evening, citizens. Hopefully, I've got sound. Rev was having some issues before, but I think we're okay.
Yep.
I'm devoid. I'm joined today by my dad, Rev Atheist, and a good friend of ours, LtHedonist. This is Redacted, a live podcast where we talk about Star Citizen and its development.
Yeah. So we brought Mr. Hedonist here today to talk about flight, right? So he's our resident flight expert, if you will. Uh, so we brought him on to talk about what flight has been like, what it's like now, just in general. What's up when you're out in your ship in the verse.
Well, you put me on a bit of a pedestal there. I might fall pretty hard on my face off of it, but yeah, just a little background. I've been playing Star Citizen now for just a couple of years, so I haven't been around since like the beginning of the flight model, and to see how all that has changed, or I remember from what people have told me that um, the first ship was an Aurora. Is that correct?
Something like that.
Yeah, something.
There
Like
was,
Yeah.
I think, Aurora and Constellation were among some of the first ships that were in the game. I
Yeah.
know that they were the first ships for sale.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if the Aurora flew like a brick at that time or not, and how far it's come. And now obviously like there's 100 plus other ships in the game and so forth. But I mean, I could talk about a little bit about the flight model as it is right now. You know,
Well,
Yeah,
kind of
please
pros and
do. I want
cons
to.
of
I
it.
want to hear your thoughts
Um,
as somebody who spends a lot of time, behind the joysticks, as it were.
yeah. Yeah. Behind the VKBs,
Yeah.
which I highly recommend. Shameless plug. Um, but yeah, the so right now, obviously, we have like these high top speeds in the game as it stands, where ships go like 900 some to 12, 13, sometimes 1400 meters a second top speeds, um, and we're only hindered by, I guess, the current cap for each specific ship that CIG has put in, or atmospheric conditions, right? Um, and a lot of people like that because they like that uninhibited speed. You could just accelerate, especially if you've heard about like the tricording maneuver. I don't know, are you familiar with that?
Oh, we are, but go ahead and explain it anyway, just in case people who are watching aren't.
So it's not overly intuitive for people who are just like getting into the game per se, but it's the idea that you're using three thrusters at once to project yourself almost like at a 45-degree sort of angle, gliding through space. So it'd be your main thruster, um, your strafe up, your belly thrusters, as it were, and then also a lateral thrust. So the idea, of course, especially when you're in a zero G environment where you don't have any drag or anything like
Yeah, no air
fighting
resistance, no gravity.
exactly. Um, Utilizing those three thrusters, you can propel yourself, accelerate at an extreme speed, but it's got to be at a 45-degree angle, right? Either up and to the left or up and to the right. So if you're currently flying in the verse, I would encourage you to try it, where you go decoupled and then you use again forward strafe, up strafe, and a lateral strafe. With boost, you'll get like 20 Gs plus. Some of the ships, especially like the Hornet right now, go like 28 Gs. It's like you black out almost in an instant if you're not careful.
mm,
So, so the main thing is this uninhibited high top speed though has problems. Namely, when you're flying at I think what is it? Captain Burks likes to say Mach Jesus.
Yep, Mock
When you're flying at
Jesus.
Mach Jesus, it's hard to slow yourself down in time if you're not used um, to that amount of force. And a lot of people end up colliding with the largest kind of rocks, which are generally planets or moons, right? Um, but aside from that, in combat, it causes a lot of issues with jousting, right? Like I'm flying at Devoid right now, and he's flying at me, and we're gonna fight each other, and then he's approaching, and I'm approaching, and we're trying to just get to each other, because we're so excited to fight and shoot laser beams at each other, right? But before you know it, because we've gained all of this speed and momentum, we just zoom right by each other, and then we're like, no, 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 come back, So um, the problem, of course, is especially for newer players that aren't used to managing their momentum and managing their speed and recognizing what the HUD is telling you, right? Your current speed, your opponent's current speed, and the combined speed of each other. If you're not familiar with all that stuff, then you just start jousting again and again and again and again.
Yeah, if you're
So, I
lucky, you
mean, what?
joust. If you're not lucky, then you head-on collision.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Talk about target fixation. For anyone who's ridden a motorcycle or anything like that, you got to be careful with that. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the cool thing, but also the not so good thing about the current flight model. Um, those high top speeds are a lot of fun, and it feels good to be zooming, but then lasers don't always connect right because it's a lot of information for the server to process at that high speed. So, and then of course, especially like turret gunning is not always effective at high top speed. Things don't sync up right, especially with the current targeting system for turret gunning. So it's got a number of issues, like a kind of a higher skill ceiling to manage that momentum and traversal. Um, and again, like you guys have flown around in atmosphere as well, so there are some atmospheric conditions
Mhm.
to contend with, even with our current flight model. But it sounds like that's going to be changing soon with like control surfaces and things in the near future. Um, and of course, with the new flight model with master modes. So,
Yeah, so that's a whole lot of information, right?
yeah.
So yeah, current flight model, right? So something that I've heard people say, which when you're thinking from a realism standpoint, is fairly true, right? But the argument that I hear against master modes, and we'll explain what master modes is in just a minute, right? Is that it is unrealistic to limit your speed in space when the uh, potential for acceleration is infinite, right? You could accelerate infinitely and always gain speed, right? They say, oh, well, why are we limited to 1400 meters per second if we could accelerate infinitely, and why can't we use that sort of mechanic, right?
That sounds like an awful
And
idea, honestly.
it does, it really does, right? And I'm just gonna throw out my own example because I recently read the Expanse series, and they touch on this, right? The Expanse series was written with the idea of writing a sci-fi story based on as realistic principles as possible, right? Obviously, they have to embellish some things because it's sci-fi, but they recognized that infinite acceleration mechanic that exists, right? And when you get into that level of acceleration, then the battles, right? If you're fighting somebody, it doesn't take place over the course of seconds or minutes if you're lucky, but hours, sometimes days, because you get these such vast distances, right? You're launching projectiles through space that will accelerate forever. You're talking millions of kilometers where you're separate and you're accelerating so quickly, right? And you've got these torpedoes that go for millions of kilometers and they'll accelerate, and then they'll have to decelerate to maneuver and stuff. And in a game like Star Citizen, right, it's just not feasible. It's not, right? Because if the server is trying to track projectiles across millions of kilometers, right? If you're trying to go from one planet, right, and shoot a projectile across the system, that's going to be one over time become a lot of entities the server has to track for a long time. Synchronizing is going to be rough, and it's just not feasible in,
Yeah,
in the game,
I,
right?
I've got something else to add to that. Right, you mentioned
Sure.
for a moment deceleration, right?
Yeah.
So
Deceleration.
yeah, so you could conceivably accelerate, accelerate, accelerate. I'm going to this moon, accelerate, accelerate. Do that a little bit too long, and you're going to hit the moon.
You're going to
Even
become the
even
moon. Yeah.
even if that means you're decelerating for half an hour. If you've like been accelerating for like 45 minutes, you're like, "Oh shit." You flip around, you start decelerating. You're going to hit the moon in half an hour.
If you are a couple seconds too late, you're hitting that moon,
You
right?
know?
Because
So
equal and opposite reaction, right? You accelerate for 45 minutes to come to a stop, you got to decelerate at the same rate for
and
the
you,
same time.
and you don't
Right.
have like more power to decelerate faster. You just don't.
Right. So that whole argument, going back to my original point, the argument of, well, in theory, we should be able to accelerate infinitely. It wouldn't work in this type of situation. And we're
Right.
faced with a problem now where we do have, just like Hedonist said, these high speeds, which in terms of dogfighting and how the game is played, can be unmanageable to the newer pilot, somebody who doesn't understand exactly as described all the elements of the HUD, what they mean, and how to utilize them to your advantage. So,
Yeah.
with that being said, Hedonist, tell us a little bit about your experience with master modes and maybe what it is.
Yeah, so I guess from my understanding, master modes is trying to separate the ship into two modes of functioning, as far as one being navigation and the other mode being like, and I apologize, I don't know specifically what it stands for, if it's standard
I
control
think it's
mode or
standard combat mode. It
standard
doesn't really
combat mode.
matter though. I
Yeah,
think that's what it is.
SCM, right? SCM mode is your like normal operation, and then there's the nav mode. So what does that mean? Nav mode is unhindered. So essentially, it's what our current flight model is. You can fly at high top speeds and manage those speeds how you like, get around a lot faster, but it comes with the caveat that your shields are inoperable. So I don't know what the logic is. I guess you're diverting power from the rest of the ship to engines and maneuverability, the maneuvering thrusters
Yeah,
and
I
so
think the
forth.
logic there is that the
So
quantum drive specifically pulls a lot of power.
there you go. So and
And
then of
yeah,
course, yeah, you're going to be able to quantum, and then there's the quantum boost, right? Is that that's going to be a thing where you can
yeah.
quantum like almost manually for short distances, correct?
Yeah. So you
Yeah,
can
short distances.
engage the quantum drive without having a destination locked in. So you just off you go.
Yeah,
Right.
the idea there is that it's supposed to be short distance, like you said, limited to roughly the distance between a planet and its moon.
And it's
So,
also, I think, going to be where like you're holding it the whole time,
mhm,
essentially, and when you let up and it stops,
something like that.
as opposed to simply saying engage, and it's going until you arrive.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like a mega boost of sorts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
basically, yeah.
and then of course your standard control mode or standard combat mode. Um, that's when your ship's weapons are functional and so forth. It'll, I think we're going to come back to this a lot, but it's like time will tell what CIG decides to do with each of these modes. And what I mean by that is like in nav mode, can you use your flares? I mean, that is that solely a combat thing,
Right.
right? Or not?
So
But
they've described it, at least as far as I can recall, that all of your weapon systems are tied together. So your guns, your missiles, and your flares
mm,
are tied to that. It That's at least how it works now, and I believe they intend to keep it that way. But with the idea that quantum mode, if you make the decision to sacrifice defensibility, offensibility, just combat capabilities, period, in order to gain speed, like there has to be a sacrifice there. If you engage quantum mode and you could just flare off missiles, then like what's the point, right?
yeah,
Um, and just to kind of tangent a little bit, it's pretty important to remember that CIG intends for Star Citizen to be a fairly complex game, one of those games that's easy to learn, difficult to master, right?
Yeah.
So you get in, and if you get to the point where you're doing high level dogfighting with people who spend hours behind a desk every week just mastering it, right? Things like disengaging from a fight have to be a very tactical choice. You have to time it right. You have to understand, when do you save the transition from quantum mode because you need to use your flares because you're waiting for them to lob missiles, right? After they lob missiles, you flare. What's the time look like to make that switch and get out of there? It's going to be a really strategic thing. So it's not going to be as simple as, oh, quantum mode and dump flares until you can get out of there.
right.
They're really trying to avoid that. So
It has to
with
be a
that in
very
mind,
active
right?
decision. Um,
Correct.
and that is a thing because, like you said, there is a lull between changing from like the combat mode to the navigation mode. Um, so and then of course, just to reiterate back and backtrack a little bit, but like that standard combat or standard control mode reduces your speeds significantly, right? It reduces them to the point where um, it's a preset for each ship. Um, like max speed. I think for like the Gladius right now, it's like 230 some meters a second, which is huge difference compared to the 1200 meters a second we have now, max speed that you can essentially hit anytime in 0G. Um, and then you can use your boost to go beyond that a certain amount, a certain extent, which I think, again, like with the Gladius is maybe like 400 some. I can't recall exactly. I know with like the Buccaneer, for example, since
Buccaneers
it's got
wicked
those,
fast.
yeah, in a straight line, it's
Straight
wicked
line.
fast right now. It's like 530 some. So like if we're incorporating the idea of disengaging, for example, devoid, like, you know, because people complain about jousting, but jousting is a viable strat, and I think it will be more so in certain instances with master modes. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is, like, for example, the Buccaneers play style may be that you put like all ballistics on it. And because you have a very high boost speed, you could just, get your shots in and then joust through the opponent, get away, get your shields back, because you're not probably going to win any kind of what's called a turn rate fight, where literally like the one ship, like an arrow, can outturn and outmaneuver the Buccaneer, which is a slower turning ship. So the Buccaneer could maybe get some good shots in, do some hull damage, and then zip away where the arrow may not be able to accelerate as fast, and then come back and do it again, right? So different ships will have different viabilities and different strats to them, which is cool, right? And learning those things uh, will make you a better pilot, right? And knowing how to react in each situation. So, um, but yeah, the Buccaneer could just potentially like zip away in a straight line, boost, and then go into nav mode, and hopefully, the other pilot doesn't recognize that, and
Right.
capitalize.
Yeah, that's
But
that whole question that we brought up of, okay, is he going to use missiles? Does he have missiles
yeah,
left?
right.
If I switch out, am I going to lose my ability to flare? Buccaneer's not, I mean, it's not the tankiest ship. You lose one of
Right.
those wingtips, and it's maybe not so big a deal in 0G, but if you're in an atmospheric fight,
Duct tape
could
and
be
So
bolts, right?
duct tape and
I'd,
bolts.
I'd, I'd like to kind of mention something about master modes that I think is interesting that I don't think people have talked about too much, and that's the effect that master modes will have on combat involving capital ships, like large ships,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
Because
Yeah, 100%.
currently you got these little ships, super zippy, man. They can all over the place. Those turrets can't line up on those things. They can't, right? So the turrets are essentially useless against small ships, right? But with the master modes, if you're in combat mode, now all of a sudden you're cut way back, 200-ish, as whatever the speeds, right? All of a sudden these turrets now have a much easier time, tracking and potentially laying some fire down on these smaller ships.
You're right. If you're not hugging the hull of that ship, absolutely.
Yep. And then
100%.
yeah, and then a secondary effect for your own ships, your own fighters, if they're needing to get away, the potential that they could come back on the back side of you to get a little cover so that potentially they could get away even. So there's some interesting
Strong defensive point is what you're saying.
exactly what I'm saying.
There's
And there's some
there's
interesting things that can come about in that type of gameplay. And
That's
I'm
100% correct.
I am always going to be bringing in the cap ships because I love cap ships,
S-
and I'm very
So
interested to see how that could
I
affect
think
that type of play.
I think you're 100% correct, Rev. Like the strength of a turreted ship, a multi-crew ship, is going to skyrocket, because um, especially if they don't change the velocity speeds of projectiles. Because you're telling me that, like, for example, right now cannons fire like the velocity is like 700 meters a second, right?
700. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that means it takes 1 second to go 700 meters, right? Well, that's pretty freaking slow when the ship that you're flying against is going like 800, 900 meters and zipping around. And it's a tiny little ship like an arrow or something, right? That's like hard to freaking hit. That's why most people use repeaters right now in PvP. But if my top speed is only 300 and the velocity of the projectile is 1400 still, yeah, I mean, the chance that I'm gonna get dinged by a freaking turret gunner is way higher now, right? And I can't easily disengage as much, like, as I could before from a ship, because right now, I mean, an Aurora can take down a Hammerhead.
Yeah, and
easy.
and
I mean,
even
it
that
takes a while, but
even that
you just
lateral movement across the turret, I'm
yeah.
gonna be able to follow that a lot easier.
There's also another point, since we're on the capital ship subject,
Of course we
that
are.
I'd like to bring up, right? And that is that they are changing with master modes the distances in which projectiles travel before like
Mm.
despawning, right? The effective ranges. They're aiming for right now. The effective range of most repeaters is roughly 1,500 meters, right? Am I correct in saying that, Hito?
Yeah, yeah.
Roughly.
It's yeah, 1,500 meters for laser repeaters is yeah,
Yeah.
that's about right.
So, and the idea is that, because of the speed compared to the speed that you're fighting at, right? Like that's just a reliable distance to make sure that you hit your shots, right? Well, reducing the speed of combat, reducing how fast you're flying, effectively increases that effective range where you can reliably hit shots. And CIG is aiming for up to 6 or 7 kilometers of effective
Nice.
firing range. So that is going to open up an entire question strategically. Since we're talking about cap ships, where do you position that cap ship? If you're sending out a squadron of fighters, where do you aim to put those fighters in relation to an enemy cap ship? You know, because if you're
Right.
say 4 kilometers away from an enemy cap ship and you're dogfighting, suddenly, cap ship cannons are in range. It's an effective fight. So it's a lot to think about in terms of not just dogfighting, but the future of space combat. Period.
Well, and if you think about, we're going to be talking about building bases and stuff. That's pretty scary if the capital ship can like do an aerial bombardment from 6 kilometers away. You're like,
It
oh
is. It is
God,
too. And if you
here comes the
take
Redeemer or whatever, like look
yeah,
out. Like
and
so
if you're doing like a base raid or something, right? We're going
yeah.
off on all kinds of tangents. We'll circle
We
back
are,
in a
we are,
minute.
we
We
are,
got
yeah.
plenty of time now. If you do like a base raid where you take, a group of fighters in and you're trying to, take care of this player base, right? And they've got anti-air turrets like on the ground. It's even just getting there is going to be a whole deal where
Yeah.
maybe you got to send in ground forces to disable those turrets. Maybe you got to have like he said, a larger ship that can come into atmosphere and bombard, the
Are you?
base beforehand.
Gosh, are you saying that those ground vehicles might become useful?
I
Yeah.
really, really hope so. That's a discussion for another day, but yes,
Yeah.
that is what I'm saying.
It
So
may
yeah,
be, but it
it'll
sounds
be
like
very
it's
interesting.
it sounds like it could be a factor. But yeah, sorry. I love cap ships. I can't help it. I'm gonna bring them up every time.
No, you
They're
should.
they're majestic and glorious. I think not that the Caterpillar is necessarily a capital ship, but it's a bigger ship. I like took a beautiful screenshot of like Magda and the freaking Caterpillar just cruising with the sunset. Like bluish hue. I know everybody talks about Star Citizen being a screenshot simulator, but yeah, it's a sight to behold when a giant freaking vessel comes, like coming in, over the sunset, just menacing but also beautiful. Yeah, it's
Oh,
dope.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So
All right, get us back on track, the void.
yeah,
Right. So we talked a bit about master modes, right? And what kind of effects that might have on combat, fighter combat, capital ship combat.
yeah,
We even talked a little bit about atmospheric combat, right?
right,
So,
right.
with that regard, we're talking atmospheric combat. Let's talk control surfaces.
Mm,
We
right.
only have speculation here because we haven't gotten any kind of control surface playtesting in. But first off, let's describe a little bit what control surfaces are, right? So currently, the only effects that atmosphere has on a ship is drag. You get into a thick atmosphere, suddenly your acceleration is decreased, your top speed is decreased, you can't maneuver as quickly, and that's an important piece, right? But what control surfaces is going to offer is the ability to utilize the shape of your ship. You've got rudders, you've got flaps. I don't know all the technical terms, but you've got all these bits and bobs
Yeah,
on your ship that can move to utilize the atmosphere to move your ship, right? Just like a plane does today. This is going to have a huge effect on atmospheric combat because you may have a ship that performs very well in zero G because it maybe
mhm,
relies heavily on maneuvering thrusters for its movement. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking ships like the Kartual or the Santok Yai. Massive amounts of maneuvering thrust, right? The alien ships. You put them in atmosphere, suddenly they may not perform as well because they don't have any kind of control surfaces. They don't utilize the air to their advantage, whereas ships like the Arrow probably will.
Yep.
So, Hito, what is some speculation that you have on control surfaces and how it might affect things in regards to atmospheric flight?
So it kind of comes back to what CIG is going to decide to do, and what the balance will be between realism and like fun, I guess, so to speak. But so yeah, like if the flaps are the like I think a lot of times the primary ones on the sides of the wings, they're called alarions. If I think I'm pronouncing that
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah,
I'll take your
ailerons.
word for that.
Yeah.
I don't know the technical terms.
And then obviously, like you said, the rudder, which helps control like the yaw of the ship, right?
Mhm.
Like, if all of those become individual pieces, depending on the ship, like you said, the Arrow let's use the Arrow as an example. So, what will be interesting to see is that the control surfaces, right? All these little bits and bobs and things that move and fold to allow for lift or drag or whatever, in combination with the Maelstrom system, right?
Oof. I
So
had forgotten about Maelstrom. Thank you for bringing that
right,
up.
and we can't talk about flight without it, because if you're telling me that individual pieces and parts can now be destructible and easily shot off, then you're telling me that if I'm going to be fighting in an atmospheric fight, I'm going to be bringing all ballistics. I'm going to punch through
Yeah.
your shields, and I'm going to shoot off your little bits and bobs and make it really difficult for you to fly. And of course, winning a fight is not always blowing up your opponent. If you injure them enough to where they feel they can't maneuver and be effective and they run away, that's a victory, right?
Absolutely.
So that's what I would say, is it can have a profound effect, not only on how your ship handles and how you can maneuver as far as like hard braking or changing your trajectory or one thing or another. And then of course, like you said, each vessel may have a better flight dynamic depending on their shape and so forth. But man, it could make a huge difference on how you can fly once you take damage.
I
Like,
agree.
wow.
And
Yeah.
I'm gonna refer to a specific ship that I think most people are at least familiar with, right? It's probably the most fleshed out fighter that we have because it's CIG's gold standard Squadron 42 ship, right? The Gladius. Okay. If you have flown a Gladius, particularly in combat, and you've lost a wingtip, right? It's really easy to see more or less how that would affect you, right? Especially if you're fighting in atmosphere, because you'll notice that if you start taking those high G or high speed maneuvers in a Gladius with a missing wing, it becomes very unstable. You get that warning on your screen that says major torque imbalance, and you start
Right.
getting some unpredictable inputs. You're like, whoa, what's going on? Imagine that, but I feel like it's going to be amplified, right? Because exactly like you said, Maelstrom, and let me just explain Maelstrom really quick, just in case anybody doesn't know. Maelstrom is CIG's fully destructible environment system. And this is going to include things like trees, ground, buildings, ships. It's also going to include wear and tear for weapons and armor and things. It's the whole shebang, right? So Maelstrom, if you, like you said, take a ship fully loaded with ballistics. Let's take a Buccaneer for example, because you can put 6 ballistic guns on those things, and they're
Yeah.
gnarly, right? Or
Yeah.
5 if you keep the big one. You come in with a Buccaneer against something like a Gladius or an Arrow that is designed to be aerodynamic and effective in atmosphere, and you buzz off one of those wings, the likelihood, your combat effectiveness heavily reduced. And that's a win. If you make them have to leave or eject or crash land or whatever, that's a win, right? So it's going to be a huge series of decisions you make. Am I fighting in atmosphere? Am I fighting in space? You may have to have multiple fighters that are outfitted differently accordingly, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I am a consummate Redeemer pilot. I love the Redeemer. Right. I can tell you that control services are probably going to bring back the Vanguard, and if I'm going
Mhm.
atmosphere, good chance I'll be switching back to that Vanguard that I loved so much before the Redeemer came out.
So let's talk about why, right? The Redeemer compared to the Vanguard. Let's take those two, right? Another very important factor to control surfaces is to I'm gonna say promote realism, right? It's important to realize this is a game. It always will be, but it is a simulator of sorts, and so there's a realism factor that's there.
Yeah,
Let's take a ship like the Redeemer. It's big, it's bulbous, it's got wings,
it's
right?
a
It's
sausage.
it's a sausage. Okay, you take a Redeemer and you just sit there and hover. It's heavy. Okay, you've got a lot of power and a lot of thrust being generated to keep it up. Your heat is going to start going up. This has been described by CIG. Heat is going to be an important factor.
Yeah,
You start overheating your components, you start running into premature failures. You're gonna have an engineer, putting out fires or repairing things, right? So hovering there is not going to be an option. So ships like the Redeemer, you have to keep them moving. Some bigger ships, such as capital class ships, just won't be able to come into atmosphere because they would overheat trying to stay up. They would fail and they'd crash. They just don't have the energy to do it. Um, ships, Cyrus just mentioned the Corsair. I'm just going to throw that out there too. Corsair's got big wings, right? And it's got VTOL thrusters, but they're kind of small.
yeah, but
So I
those
feel
wings
like
are
those
funky. I'm really interested to see how that's gonna play
I
because I've
am
got one horizontal and two diagonal. It's like, what's that gonna
Yeah,
do?
it is weird. It is weird. I'm curious as a Corsair pilot. I'm also curious to see. I think it'll do okay. It's one of those ships that's meant for exploration. It's
Yeah,
meant to
they'll figure it
fly
out.
long distances over planets. I think it's going
Mm.
to do fine, but it's one of those as long as it's moving. It's like if you need to go into VTOL, you better be landing. You can't just
Well,
sit there and hover.
you might be able to bank like in one like direction versus the other a lot
Hmm.
differently,
Oh,
Um,
true.
but because of the wing structure. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how all that works, and even if they decide to really like incorporate G forces and stuff and like
Mm.
atmospheric drag, like to what extent does that mean if I rip my ship like turning it too hard, is that going to damage my components sooner, right? Because of all that the G forces and drag of doing that. uh yeah, you caught it. Nice catch there, Devoid.
Thank you. Thank you.
um, but yeah, that's definitely something that we'll have to see what it means in the future.
I have.
Speaking of hovering, like the VTOL modes, ships with VTOL will be highly prized, I would say, in the new flight model. For
Mhm.
example, because Rev, you were talking about the Vanguard.
Yeah,
I love the Vanguard.
I love the Vanguard.
I think it's a great looking ship. It's tanky. I love you can get like a turret gunner in there. It's awesome. It's got all the different variants. The Warden, I think, is my favorite right now.
Yeah, naturally,
But
I like the Harbinger.
oh yeah, missile boat. Yeah, lobbing some big missiles at people is always fun. Um, but the thing of it, like I used to love flying the hoplite, and I'm like, oh, the hoplight's a great, like it's tanky, and you could like land, drop ship people. But in reality, now if you're talking about this new control surfaces with master modes, I might want the Cutlass instead, because as a dropship anyway, as a dropship, because you have more hatches for people to pop out of when you drop down, and you can fly aggressively at the ground now, turn on your VTOL engines and aggressively stop, where the Harbinger can't do that as easy. You know what I mean? So you could potentially be in and out much more effectively and efficiently with ships that have VTOL appropriate engines. So it introduces a lot of other
Hmm.
variables again, which the thing I like about CIG and their ship model is that many ships have specific purposes. So if you're like, hey man, I want to be a dropship pilot, you know what? There's going to be ships that are really good for that,
Valkyrie. Oh,
Yeah,
The Valkyrie will
exactly.
have its
fucking
day.
love the Valkyrie.
I really one day.
Right? What a cool ship, and barely anybody flies it these days. And I know if there's a lot of people watching this, potentially they're gonna be like, I fly the Valkyrie. I love the Valkyrie. I can't believe he said that. That's my favorite ship. God damn it. But
Oh,
but realistically,
mhm.
I'm sorry. Nobody, hardly anyone flies that damn ship, and it's such a cool ship. So
It really is. Really quick, Cyrus asked a question that I think Hito can speculate on. He says, "Do you guys think the F8C will fly similar in the coming updates?" As kind of a meta ship right now, I know that you've got some experience not just flying it but also fighting it. How do
Yeah,
you think master modes and control surfaces will affect that ship specifically?
I think it'll fly decent. I think it'll probably fly a little bit like the Vanguard does right now, Cyrus. Um, because but again, it's that ship has like 8 mini main thrusters in the rear. And I think its forward momentum is going to be huge, kind of like the the Buccaneer that we were talking about, right? But I don't think it'll handle like really well in the turn, especially in the atmosphere. Um, and I hope it doesn't. I hope they nerf it a little bit because currently the problem is not that it has a lot of guns. That's fine. The problem is that has a lot of guns and it's got good shields and it's got decent like hull HP and it's got like one of the top speeds in the game. For a heavy fighter especially. It does like so many things so well, and I mean, good pilots like the Avenger Squadron guys and other people have demonstrated that smaller ships can beat it for sure. They can outturn it. They can definitely especially a group of good pilots can defeat it. But where it stands right now is just it's in such a like good spot that a horde of those things is just frightening. They're just frightening in the hands of good pilots.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess long story long, as my significant other would like to say, I think it will get a nerf, and like lighter, more nimble ships could probably like run circles around it.
I think so too, right? So the F8 is one of the newest heavy fighters, or one of the newest fighters, period, they put in. And CIG has this habit of putting out a ship and it's ridiculously overpowered, right? I'm going to refer back to the Ion when it first came out. It was one-shotting most fighters in the game with that size 7 heavy cannon.
Yeah.
And it makes sense, right? And then it got nerfed into the ground.
Yeah, well, they do that, right? They put it in, and then
Well, that's what I'm
and
saying.
then
That's what I'm saying.
They put it out at its maximum capacity, maximum capability, and then they dial it back. So
Right.
so
and
that's just to
that's
be
what I'm getting
expected.
at. So with I think that they're holding off on a knee jerk nerf like they usually do because they're working so hard on master modes. And it's why nerf something if the entire flight model is going to change, right? Just get it in. So I think that's what's going to happen. It is definitely going to get a nerf. I'm almost certain of that. And regards to the way it flies, I mean, you kind of touched on it. You said that you don't think it's going to fly as good, especially in atmosphere. I don't think it's going to do great in atmosphere. I'm going to go off on the side a little bit and just bring up a little bit of a lore piece, right? Because it's part of how CIG designs their ships is also around lore. You have to understand that the combat ships that are built by the military manufacturers, specifically Aegis and Anvil, were built with very specific goals in mind, right? The Hornet, the F7, the F8, those were built during the Vandal War. The F7 in the early days, the F8 in the later days, but they were built to combat very specific Vandal ships. I used to know, and I'm sure I could find it pretty easily, the exact kind of ladder that they went, where the uh, the UEE Navy had this ship, the Vandal had this ship, and they kept losing fights. And then the UEE responded by building this ship, which could take these out, and then the Vandal responded by building this ship, which could take these. And it was just this kind of step thing, right? So each of these ships have a very specific design purpose.
A ship arms race of sorts, huh?
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. And so most of this combat during the Vandal War was in space. There was some planetary stuff going on, but most of that was handled by the foot soldiers, right? But most of the space combat was done in space. And so I think that a lot of those, military specific heavy fighters, aside from obviously we know the Arrow is going to do great in the atmosphere, I feel like most of them are going to really shine in space. And atmospheric combat, I think, is going to be an opportunity for the civilian manufacturers to kind of shine. At least that's what I hope to see. Things like the Buccaneer, it's got those big engines, but it's got wings. It's got those sort of maneuvering flaps in the back, and I think that, while the maneuvering thrusters are real shitty, it's not going to do well in space. I think it might have an edge on something like an F8 in atmosphere because it does have the wings, it has the flaps, and it has the ability to utilize the air. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for. And based on what little I know, I think that's what we might see.
Yeah. So real quick for Cyrus, the lore can be found in the Galactopedia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly
Maybe
what the
Rev
link
can
on
get you a
that.
link.
Yeah, I'll see if I can get a link and add that. Let me take a note.
Gloom says make Railgun grateful again. That's a whole different discussion, but I agree.
Yeah, strap them on your ship. Use them instead of repeaters.
Yeah, I have a great picture. It's of a dude standing on top of a Corsair with a railgun shooting a hammerhead. Fantastic. But yeah, so master modes. control surfaces. There's one more aspect that I'm going to bring up because I think it's an important one. We talked about Maelstrom. We talked about control surfaces in terms of Hito specifically said, "Hey, if I'm doing high G maneuvers consistently, is that going to affect my components?" Right? Engineering is kind of the next pillar of that I think that we should touch on. And for things like fighters, it's not going to be a huge deal, right? Because obviously you're not going to be able to get out of your ship and go fix your shit, right? But with engineering, what will matter is how you set up your ship. Because it's been detailed to us that, before you take off, you may want to set up your components to utilize power specific ways. Maybe you put a little bit of extra juice to your coolers if you're making a long trip to make sure you stay cool, or
Maybe you want to
maybe
swap out some components that are kind of worn,
exactly, you know?
that they work, they're potentially subject to failure in the short term.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. If you've had the same fighter for, 5 or 6 big, events in a row, say, "Hey, oh, I haven't swapped out my cooler in, 3 or 4 weeks," or, "Oh shit, the capacitor that controls my guns has been, malfunctioning a little bit recently. Maybe you gotta swap some relays out. Maybe you gotta replace that cooler." So it's, less about flight model at that point and just more about, pre-flight checks, but I still think it's an important thing to talk about
Reflect
because
checks. Nice.
Yeah.
because if you have gone a while without maintaining your components or without repairing, then you may want to avoid things like high G maneuvers. Because if you start building up that heat and your components can't keep up, then you might hurt yourself more than your opponent's going to hurt you. What do you think about that, Hito?
So I think that you should probably avoid high G maneuvers while engineers are working in the ship so they don't fall on their asses.
No, I
Like
agree, right? But I'm just talking like
no, I joke a
fighters.
little bit, but honestly, like that's a logistical thing too, right? It's going to be interesting, like to what extent that has an effect, especially with the decrease in top speeds, right?
Mhm.
Is it going to be more like Sea of Thieves where you can just like zoom around, and like patch up your boat, with the patch up one thing
Hammer
or
and nails.
but I know it's not like that. Like you said, it's changing relays, it's putting out fires, it's things like that. But still, yes. So engineering and how your fighter, let's say your single seater works. Yeah, that'll be interesting. I wonder if they'll have because right now we have the MFDs for our component health, right?
Yeah.
But I wonder if they'll switch it so like that if you have that MFD up, it starts to you can like categorize by like high to low HP or like hey like you can get an alert like this starts flashing because this is either overheating or wearing out and it's like a preemptive because I would hope in the year what are we 2955 coming up now
2953. Yep. Or
53
2954 now. 54.
54 okay so 2954 I would hope that the systems on your ship are intelligent enough to tell you hey like you probably have this much more mileage on this thing, I mean,
Service engine soon.
our cars do that. Yeah, exactly, right?
Time for
You
oil
know?
change.
I can't get this thing off my screen, off my Subaru, because it's telling me. But anyway, so yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that works, what
I agree.
the
It would be
longevity of that is, depending on like if you buy like racing components, they said, I believe in the engineering thing, like that it's gonna be high performance. They're gonna help you
wear
go
out
really
quickly.
fast, but they wear out quickly. Um, so pros cons, right? And I think that's good. I posted something on Spectrum recently, for example, about distortions and how like I like when things have specified roles because you could set your ship up in such a way where you're like, man, I do this thing really well, right? I can zip it. I'm a good scout, right? I can zoom in and out, but I'm not the best at dogfighting, and I like that. I like that everything can have a place, and that there is not one like elite ship or an I win button of sorts, right? So I hope that that's the case with components and with engineering. So we'll see, though.
Yeah, I really hope so too, right? So you talked about racing components and how they might be the very tippy top in terms of performance, right? And in the short term, probably even reliability, because they have to get you through a race. They got to get you through high G maneuvers. But if after you do 5 or 10 really high G maneuvers, suddenly that reliability tanks, right?
Right.
And military components might that might be near the top, but in my head, right, knowing that the military operates on lowest bidder, right, I can imagine they might be like really really effective, wear out kind of quick, but be cheap, so you have to consistently replace them, you
Yeah,
know
maybe.
Mhm.
whereas things like industrial or civilian might be on the less effective side, but like the longevity goes up, right? And so you,
Right.
you make those decisions. If you're going
Or
to go on like this long multi-system expedition, do you swap out those military
right.
components for industrial or civilian to
Or
help
what
make sure you
happens
can
when you
get through to
put in
the
a
end?
high test component in a potentially quote unquote, like more rickety ship like a Buccaneer,
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
does that shear off my wing if I, like do do a maneuver in high atmo like microtech, where it's a little too aggressive, for like the quality of the craft. I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see where CIG kind of takes this and goes with it. Yeah, I'm excited though.
um
I'm excited to see.
Mike says get rid of distortions. So I'd like to take a minute here and just kind of describe this unholy trinity of combat that CIG has kind of put out there, like their
Mhm.
intended purpose behind the different types of weapons. And Hito, feel free to hop in at any time because you probably know the specifics of this a little bit more than I do. But the different weapon types are designed to suit a specific purpose, right? So if you're fighting a ship, right, you're using lasers, they got big shields, you're probably not going to do a lot, right? Because the shields are there to absorb that kind of impact. They're gonna deflect those lasers, not going to do a lot, right? Certainly not going to do a lot of hull damage because the shields are there, right? Ballistics. But the lasers will do things like melt through like armor or hull or something. So like if you do get through the shields, then suddenly you're doing like I think it's hull damage. It'll go through hull, right? So you kind of
Mhm,
got to eat
mhm.
away at shields, eat away at the armor, but then like once that armor's eat away, it just will plow through the hull. Is how I understand it. Ballistics will basically ignore those shields, as far as I understand, and get through armor, but they won't do as much damage to the hull. I'm misunderstanding, but they
Uh,
have a purpose,
yeah,
right? And then distortions, I believe, are meant to do things like eat through shields and do component damage for
yeah.
like disabling.
Well, as it currently stands, yeah, like the laser weapons do the most shield damage.
Hmm.
Distortions do a bit of shield damage, but effectively do a lot of component damage, and shut down components once shields go down. And then ballistics penetrate through shields to an extent, depending on how much shielding is on that ship, and do direct hull damage. And they don't do specific component damage yet that I'm aware of.
I think that'll
Um,
come in with Maelstrom.
And
With
with
yeah,
like
and with
your
component targeting.
yeah. Well,
yeah,
component targeting exists now, I think, but
to
N-
to to a
to an ex-
minimum.
mhm.
to
Yeah,
an
to
extent. I know that
to a
you can
minimum.
get on ships that have components accessible, and you could like shoot them or punch them, and it'll disable that component. Like you can pull
Yeah.
a ship out of quantum by blowing up its
So
quantum drive.
so you know what? You're right about that actually. The best example of this is using the Vanguard Rev, loading it up with like 32 size 1 missiles and going to effing town on a hammerhead. Especially if you keep hitting like the hammerhead in the center of the ship, its shields will shut down. The guns still work, it still flies, but the shield generators must be like close to the center of the ship and they're done. So I don't know if it's because of the splash damage from the missiles that do that. So perhaps again, I haven't done the testing myself with like the 84, 85Bs to see if it does the same. But there is to an extent you can do that right now, and like you said, you can sub-target components a little bit. But nowadays, for those who don't know, you could just sub-target engines and like turrets and things like that without a problem previous patches, but now you have to scan the ship first in its entirety for the most part,
Oh,
and then you can like sub target like the engines on a cutlass, and then it's done. Right, like because you know how when a cutty loses an engine it just goes into a freaking spin. Yep, it's done, but you have to scan it first, so that sounds appropriate. That'll probably be what happens in the future. But yes, so that's the three things: ballistics through shields, energy weapons, busting down shields faster and then doing hull damage significantly, and then the distortions. What MD is referring to, though, is we're currently in the current state of the game, distortions are very strong, meaning not only do they do a bit of shield damage, but they do a ton of component damage once shields go down. And you only need like one, maybe two of those distortion repeaters on your ship to be effective at shutting down ships. So
And
now,
small ones too.
exactly. And it's frustrating because the meta right now is such that whoever's shields go down first essentially loses if the other individual continues to hit shots on you, like very quickly, because your guns go down very quickly after that. You can't fight back. And if you can't fight back, what are your options? Well, you can run away, right? And wait for everything to reboot, which could take like 2 to 3 minutes, or you can use your ship as a battering ram. So it really negates the type of gameplay that you can have at that point, and it's not fun. It's not fun. It's it it I don't enjoy it. Like I mean I play with it because it's the current meta and it's effective, but it's not fun for me to like just chase somebody who's running away now for however many minutes, and it's not fun for me to run away either. I mean, honestly, like if somebody like takes down my shields don't recharge anymore, not, and usually my guns, like I said, don't either. I just accept defeat. I'm like, okay, you win. Like bye. Like like what can I
Yeah.
do? I can't do anything anymore. So, like the post I put on Spectrum, for example, I was saying, hey, like distortions should be specific, right? Again, ships in this game have roles. Each role is specific to a certain situation for the most part, and not every ship needs to be a distortion ship, right? Make it. I don't know how you want to go about that necessarily, but make it so that you have to have like a specific distortion loadout to be effective, versus just throwing it on and then all of a sudden every ship can be shut down, or every ship is a ship that can shut other ships down. So, but again, that'll come with time and balancing, and CIG will figure it out. They tend to, just a matter of time.
We have a few minutes before we end it. Do you have uh, a preferred way distortions would work? If you could build the distortion system or the weapon system in general, how would you do it to make distortions viable but not overpowered?
Well, again, just going with the ethos of having specific purpose and fulfilling a role, and of course being a part of a team, because we're playing in an MMO, right? I would have it where distortion, because right now distortion damage is flat, right? You just like every component has this, it'll take a certain amount of distortion damage and then it shuts off for like 2, 3, 5 minutes, whatever the hell it is. I would have it like a resistance to it. So like I hit him with the distortion, but depending on the resistance of the type of component, it fights against that distortion. So essentially, what that means is you need to hit a threshold of damage, distortion, continuous distortion damage, to be effective at shutting down a ship. Because that's like, what's the point of it? You're trying to shut down a ship to board it, to take its loot, to illegally tow it, whatever you're doing, right? Because you want that thing intact for the most part. And okay, yes, in a combat situation, it's still fun to watch somebody just fall out of the sky in Atmo and watch them splash on the ground. That's fun too. But having a system where the distortion damage is resisted, so you have to have a ship that's specifically outfitted to do distortion damage would be, in my opinion, ideal. That way you also have other ships that can bust through the shields effectively, because distortion damage doesn't do a whole lot to shields, you know and in fact maybe it should do even less. So that way you have like team members. Hey, I'm the guy that takes down the shields primarily, you're the guy that shuts down the ship, you're the guy that flies the tow truck, to salvage this thing, whatever, right? And bring it to the claw, the reclaimer or whatever, right? To break it down and mash it up. So it's cool to see like things like that are specific, team oriented, and form an ecosystem, you know, versus, well, it's the meta. I'm just gonna slap a couple of these on here because it's the best thing.
Right.
Yep.
I just have one more question, and I think it's a good one. We all know the changes that are coming. We just had talked about it for an hour. What are you afraid of seeing, knowing what's coming in terms of master modes and control surfaces?
Oh, um, I well, I'll tell you right now. I want like we talked about meaningful decisions, like when you choose to go from combat mode to nav mode, right? Things like that. Um, I like that. I'm just afraid that I don't know how to say this well, but like I hope that that goes with like many other things regarding flying, but it doesn't like limit you, if that makes sense. Oh, God, I don't know how to describe this. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Like you want those mechanics to be difficult but still viable. You're
Yeah, I
afraid that
mean,
they're gonna like
so
what I'm
so
hearing you say. Go ahead.
I think everything has its role and its place and its purpose. I think a part of me is just kind of sad that like because I like flying fast, zippy ships that are that are just that, and they've decreased the top speeds quite a bit. I think they need to increase those speeds to make these ships viable. Because I'm telling you right now, like these light fighters and stuff are going to have a hell of a time with capital ships and multi crew ships and heavy fighter. The heavy fighter meta is coming, especially the ones, the Hurricane, the Vanguard, things like that, like
Scorpius.
the Scorpius. Like, be scared because like those ships that are tanky and have a ton of firepower, and with like the way things are moving slower, those turrets are going to shred people. Just absolutely demolish them, and that's cool, but I think there needs to be a bit of a balance because if you're telling me I've got this nibble zippy fighter, I like things to be approachable, which is what they're doing, right? Kind of like Rocket League, soccer cars, right? It's approachable. You can get in a car and you can bop a soccer ball around, but then you can learn all these maneuvers. There's a lot of depth to it. Like that's the point of the arrow, for example. It's squishy, but it's maneuverable. There's a lot of ceiling to hit and learn and like and figure out and play. I'm afraid that we're gonna go in such a direction where just like these like multi-crew ships just completely effing dominate everything, and then your little arrows become meaningless. The poor little arrow. So that's
So
that's my fear.
I get that really quick. I just want to state a rebuttal to that, right? And we don't have to spend too long because we're kind of coming up on time here. But let's take that multi cruise ship. Let's take that fleet battle idea that you have going on. Okay, you've got a couple of Idrises. They've got maybe some like a Constellation Andromeda or two. Maybe like a Polaris. The bigger multi cruise ships that would shit on the light fighters, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Now let's say somewhere behind the line of scrimmage, so to say, you've got a little Eclipse there, little stealth ship. Okay. The Eclipse is a big example here because the Eclipse is a very small single seater that
Right.
carries a massive wallop, right?
Quite the payload. Yeah.
Right. So it is not feasible to take a big multi crew ship and go fight that thing. It's going to be faster. It's going to be more maneuverable. It'll just leave and it'll become, you're going to lose it on radar. It's going to find another hidey hole. It's going to keep doing its thing, right? I think that I'm going to throw a random ship out here that I think is going to be important. Ships like the Terrapin paired with those light fighters are going to be really important, right? You're going to have
Yeah.
these small, maneuverable, big scanning ships like the Terrapin that's going to say, "Oh, I'm picking up something in this area of space." You send your fighters, right? Because Eclipse is going to be much less effective at running away or defending itself against those fighters,
Right.
And so, are they going to be useless? I don't think so. But just like you've kept saying, they're going to have their place.
Yeah.
Would I take,
Yeah.
a wing of arrows against a Polaris? Hell no. Absolutely not. Those turrets are going to get it before they even get within, striking distance. You know, they're going to have their place, and I'm excited for the day when that place is not everything. Because right now, a fighter, like you said, you can kill a
Yeah.
Hammerhead with an Aurora.
You totally can.
Fighters
100%.
dominate everything. So
Yeah.
I think they're going to have their place. I'm excited for that.
I have my own final question.
Sure.
Right. So something that we haven't really talked about, but you did mention it when we were talking about the Eclipse, right? The stealth ship, the smaller, more nimble stealth fighters, right? So your
Like your Razor LX.
like your Saber or anything just equipped with
Yeah.
your stealth components, so that they can get in undetected quickly, and then just start unloading. How do you think the stealth on especially those smaller fighters might play into that final balance?
I think
Great
that
question.
again, it's just another layer. And I think that they'll be pretty effective. Already, CIG's working with some of the signature values. I don't know if you've noticed that at all, Rev, but like the Saber is actually more stealthy, and especially like the Hornet Ghost right now is quite a good ship for a couple reasons. Because it pops off of your radar, you can't target it like after like 2.5 kilometers, and coupled with like its fast acceleration, it's really effective now, like in that regard. So you're telling me like I can zoom in to a situation, get some shots off, lob some missiles, do whatever, and then I can zoom away if I'm feeling threatened and get my shields back. Like what a headache that these stealth ships may prove to be towards other fighters, towards other ships as well. Um, but again, that's up to the pilots, to determine how long they're going to stay in the engagement. But one of the things like that has always been very strong is when um, a ship can dictate the engagement, right? When you can choose and pick your fights, that is a strong ship. And currently, the major way that that happens in this flight model is the acceleration of a ship, right? The Hornet does not have it does not have the top speed of a Razor. It doesn't go 1400 meters a second, but it doesn't matter because currently the Hornet can do 28 Gs in a tricord and get the hell out of there fast, right? So when you can dictate a fight, whether it's by speed and acceleration, whether it's by being targeted or not, right, like the stealth ships, um, that's going to introduce a very interesting factor. And then it comes back to what Devoid said. Hey, I now want the freaking what's the little the Drake ship, the new one with the radar,
Cutter
the
Scout.
scout. I want to Cutter Scout around, so I can detect these stealth ships, or I want a Terrapin, right?
Right.
How
Oh, and tangent here. Are you going to be able to share radar with with your fleet? If you have a scanning ship like a
exactly
Terrapin or a Scouter, are going to be able to say, "Oh,
if
ping, pick something
if
up and have it
if
pop
I
up
can
on other people's
share
radar."
the map now with the updated star map, remember how you can share destinations,
Hmm.
locations? Why not be able to share the radar? So what I guess I'm getting at is a bit of a theme we've been talking about here is purpose driven ships,
Hmm.
an ecosystem, and seeing it come to fruition and development, right? You've got your glorious capital ships that are just majestic and awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time, right? And there's the fighters that are protecting them from like eclipses, and then you've got your Terrapins or your radar ships or your Cutter Scouts that are looking out for stealth ships, and so it's all like this kind of a multi-tiered rock paper scissors. And I guess the fear, is that the balance is good, or the fear is that the balance may be bad, whichever comes first. But yeah, I look forward to it, to those layers.
All right.
I agree. Yeah, closing statements. I agree, man. I just hope that while ships may be really, really good at something, I hope that no matter what, there's always a counter that you can prepare for. If you have
Yeah,
a ship that's really good at
Right.
stealth, I hope you have
right,
ways that you can detect it. Ship that punches really heavy, I hope that there's ways you can
right.
mitigate that.
Yeah. No
Ship
matter
that's super
what you're in, there's
maneuverable,
always something you're
right?
scared of.
As long as somebody is
Exactly,
prepared,
exactly.
there's a viable way to counter that. So I
And there it
agree. I think
is.
that's kind of yeah,
Who's on logistics? You got a good guy on logistics.
yeah,
You
exactly.
got a higher
You might be
chance
all
of
right.
winning this engagement. So
Right. So anyway, I think that's us. We're about 5 minutes over, so not a big deal. I think we had a great discussion today. Hito, thank you so much for being here. This was a
yeah,
fantastic talk.
thanks for having me.
I look forward to getting some more speculation as these systems are fleshed out. We get master modes in the PU, and we start getting to experiment with control surfaces and engineering. I'm super excited. So
Can't wait.
Absolutely. We
Yeah.
appreciate you joining us, and look forward to the next one. We'll see
Thank
you
you,
all
guys.
next time.
catch you next week.
Fly safe. See you in the verse. Peace.